It's too dark.
All right, well, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today, this morning. We'll get started in just a minute. We'll wait for a couple more people to join us, but thank you so much if you are already here with us. All right, perfect. All right, like I said, thank you so much for joining us this morning for our virtual tour here at the Timken. We're so excited to have you with us, and we're so excited to have Karen with us presenting on the Italian Renaissance masterpieces from the Timken and beyond. So just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Please keep yourselves muted through the lecture, which you guys already are right now, so that's great. And save all of your questions for the end. If you do end up having a question, please feel free to use the chat box down below. There should be a little button that says chat that you can use in order to drop your question, and we'll be happy to address all of those at the end. If you're joining us via Facebook, welcome to you as well. You can do the same. If you do have a question, there is the comment section there, which we'll be monitoring, and you can place your question there, and we'll be happy to address those at the end as well. Finally, this lecture is being recorded and is, as I said, being live streamed on Facebook. And afterwards, it will be posted on our YouTube page, our social media pages. So if you would like to go back and watch and any of the other tours that we've presented through the Timken, please feel free to check that out as well. Perfect. So without further ado, as I said today, we're so happy to have Karen with us presenting on Italian Renaissance masterpieces, both of the Timken and from kind of museums around the world. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand this over to Karen.
Thank you so much, Samantha. Samantha's doing a wonderful job as an intern, who's also a graduate student at UC Davis, and we're very lucky to have her. Well, Italian Renaissance masterpieces, we have so many beautiful Italian masterpieces in the Timken. I was very inspired to create this lecture. I will say, though, it was rather ambitious because the Renaissance is it's a vast topic. Covers many areas of Italy, but I'm going to concentrate on three really important centers, and that is Siena, Venice, and Florence. I will not really talk too much about Rome. And that was really the city of the high Renaissance. And so artists like Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, the three great high Renaissance masters, I will be showing you their work, but when they worked a little bit earlier in Florence. Now, you are looking at a Veneto, which is a Venetian inspired. Most of the people working in Venice during the Renaissance were not necessarily from Venice. They might be from the environs of Venice, or they went to Venice to work with some of the great artists like Bellini, Titian, Giorgione. What are the characteristics of the Renaissance? Well, let's talk a little bit about the different areas of Italy and how they were a little bit different. So the first images we're going to see is from Giotto, who was Florentine. And Giotto is really the master of the proto-Renaissance in Italy. Very natural. He was following some of the trends of humanism. He was beginning to be inspired by writers like Dante and Petrarch, who were saying that, humanism is a really important concept, not so much stranglehold by the Catholic Church. Florence was really, however, the center of humanism, the interest in mythology and literary interests, and very naturalistic. The Sienese artists were a little more conservative in their approach, and we'll start to see that as we look at some of the paintings. So we'll talk about this exquisite Veneto in our Timken collection in just a few minutes, but I did want to present to you Giotto. So Giotto was the master of Florence. And what had happened in Italy during the 14th century, the Trecento, was that we had a vast plague decimating Siena. It didn't occur till 1348. And prior to that, Siena was this master city of taxation that really helped develop the citizenry. And in terms of civic buildings, it was a very wealthy community. great farming, a lot of positive things are happening in Siena. However, with the plague, it really kind of shut down a lot of what was happening. And then what happens is the Proto-Renaissance, the development of the Renaissance really moves to Florence. So I am going to go backwards a little bit. I'm going to start here with a Florentine artist, Giotto, but I will tell you a little bit more about Siena, and it's a little bit of a more less naturalistic approach and more Byzantine in style. So just before the Proto-Renaissance, which happens in the 1300s, we had two kind of distinct styles that are evolving in Europe, and they are the Byzantine style and also the International Gothic style. So let's talk a little bit about the Byzantine style. The Byzantine style comes from the Eastern Roman Empire and situated in Constantinople. Many of the icons in the Timken show this influence of Byzantine style. And what is the characteristics? Well, very flat, more two-dimensional, lots of gold, which reflects the importance of spirituality in heaven. You know, when you show gold in a painting with gold leaf, it shows how important these religious topics are. So really, when you look at some of the Sienese painters in particular, which I'm going to show you in just a moment, you'll see more of a flatter, less naturalistic style. What we have as Giotto is this interest in evolving humanism and also awareness of the International Gothic style, which is very elegant. It began in the Burgundian courts and it was passed on by a lot of the aristocrats and also shown in manuscripts. Just one quick point, books were not printed until the Gutenberg invents the printing press in the mid-15th century, early to mid-15th century. So many books were handmade. Venice was really the city in Italy that created manuscript illuminations. But these books were passed and people stylistically adopted some of those principles. Okay, so let's begin with this exquisite Madonna and Child. Giotto became really well known for work in the Arena Chapel in Padua. And some people said in the Proto-Renaissance, early part of the Renaissance, that was the most magnificent work of art. Now, this particular Madonna and Child would have been the center panel of a 5-panel work. So a large altarpiece, polyptych 5-panel, and it would have been in the center. So let's look at the characteristics, Giotto's amazing naturalistic style. Look how the Madonna glances lovingly at the young Jesus. She is holding a rose that signifies her purity, and he tries to kind of grab it, and he's also holding, on the other hand, her index finger. So it's very loving. And also we have her exquisite cloak. She is almost always featured in a blue robes or cloak. You have, of course, these halos. You have the gold leaf, which is, of course, originates from the Byzantine style, even though I told you that Florence had a little bit more naturalistic, less flat Byzantine style. They sure were still interested in having that gold background. And then we have her Stella Maris, as I started to point out, and this beautiful face, this exquisite, and it's not so stylized. It's beginning to evolve into a more beautiful woman as opposed to maybe a flat, more two-dimensional image. You can see how three-dimensional this body is, very three-dimensional. So with that said, I just want to reiterate that Giotto was really the sort of the strong, most important early Renaissance artist. Also, we have later, Michelangelo working in Florence and Leonardo, and we're going to be talking about that very soon. So I'm going to go, because it is a short lecture and we have a lot to cover. I want to talk about this dossal, which is actually in our Timken collection. It's from 1310, about the same time as the Giotto, but it represents a little more, a little rougher stylistically. So if you make a comparison, look how modeled and three-dimensional this Madonna appears. And let's compare it to a painting. It's a dossal, which is a wooden panel. It was used for the back of churches to instruct people on religious information. So it's didactic, as I said. And what we have here is two artists working either in tandem or completing the dossal separately. Now we have the Magdalene Master and an unknown Florentine painter. The Magdalene Master creates this center portion of the dossal, and it's Madonna and Child. And if you look at stylistically, I mean, it's so much more actually Sienese in characteristics. It's a little more conservative, a little more Byzantine, flatter, less modeled, more two-dimensional, because really in the Sienese style, which is characterized by Byzantine influence, it's more about the kind of spiritual content and not so much directed toward making things look more three-dimensional. Because remember, art, when you see art projected, it's a um, two-dimensional form, three-dimensional forms and a two-dimensional picture plane. So sometimes it's really a lot of skill that helps create that sort of three-dimensionality. And we don't really see it at quite as much. Now we do see it a little bit more with the unknown Florentine painter, because here we have the forms are a little bit more modeled. But if you compare, let's say, the figures, they are much more two-dimensional. And what do we have here? It's a narrative. And if you look from left going through down to the right, we have the 12 Passions of Christ. And that refers to the last events in Christ's life, for example, Last Supper. And we have everything from the crucifixion to the lamentation. We have the many accurate details, although it's in a very crowded picture plane. So again, a dossal was meant to convey information of Christian themes. This is done prior, about 140 years before the advent of the printing press. So when people did not have access to books because they were hand done, and usually the church or the aristocracy, you had to have something that gave information. And so this would be a representation. It is the oldest piece in our collection. And again, this proto-Renaissance is sort of the segue between medieval times and as we go into the early Renaissance, which begins in the 1400s. Let's go on to our next image. This Luca de Tomei and the Crucifixion, scenes from the life of Christ, 1355. What is so remarkable about the Sienese altarpiece is a triptych, that means a 3-panel piece, and it could actually be closed, opened and closed. You see a very Gothic style in the sense that it's very pointed and high. What that means is it's a reference to Gothic architecture, which try to get the spires to ascend to heaven. So we have that stylistic interest. We also have, again, that gold leaf that we saw in Florence and in Siena. Now, as I mentioned, Siena was a very strong economy, a very active city. It just was wonderful to its citizens, and they really had a thriving community there. However, in 1348, so 7 years before this wonderful altarpiece was created, the plague begins to decimate Siena. And Siena was hardest hit more than any other city really in Italy. And 30 to 50% of the population did die of the plague. Now, that isn't to say that the plague ended in the 14th century in Siena and that was it. No, there were other instances of the plague in Italy, 16th century, for example, a resurgence of plague. So, but that particular time, mid 14th century, was really, really tough on Siena. However, this exquisite crucifixion and scenes from the life of Christ was remarkably done not too far after that really horrible time. So let's talk a little bit about this. This almond-shaped configuration holds something very remarkable in Italian art, and that is the Holy Trinity with one body. And this is the first time that's ever shown in Italian art. So we see the Holy Trinity, but one body that's kind of foreshadowed, the crucifixion. St. Francis of Assisi here. We have Mary and the angel of the Annunciation. We have the resurrection of Christ. And it's kind of interesting because we have these soldiers here, and he seems to have his foot tentatively placed on the back of the soldier, near the back. We have the Nativity and the Magi and the Lamentation, the heckling of Christ here. And this is a really beautiful part of the panel because we actually have Christ being mourned by Mary and others. So this is, a beautiful lamentation. All of it is actually very exquisite. But if you look at this Luca de Tomei, and again, probably the most important person who was the sort of the genesis of the Sienese school of Luca de Tomei and Buonaccorso was a man named Duccio. And Duccio, like Giotto, was kind of responsible for developing the school in Siena. And when we go over to Venice, and in just a little while, we'll see that Bellini, Giorgione, Titian, the line comes from really Bellini. Other artists creating work at this time, Simone de Martini, for example, really important artist in Sienese lexicon. So this is in our very own Timken, exquisite altarpiece, very small. They were used for private devotion. Sometimes they were put in niches of churches, like the next one we're going to see. So de Tomei, just a master. Now, I'm going to show you the Buonaccorso, another Sienese artist, Madonna of Humility. If you ever get a chance with St. Catherine and St. Christopher, if you ever get a chance, I hope you do one day visit Siena. It was the last trip I took before COVID, Venice and Siena and Florence. So this is a really particularly wonderful topic for me. But Siena is really revitalized. You know, you have Siena Cathedral and all these amazing works of art in the medieval city. So it bears a trip for sure. Okay, so Madonna of Humility. Again, we have an altarpiece, triptych, 3-panel. These doors could be closed. Often the donors of these panels would actually have their images painted on the outside. What we have here is, again, that use of gold leaf. And what it was is actually gold in pure form, 24 karat gold, is very thin and soft, almost like aluminum foil. So they would sort of put strips of this gold foil on wood panels. Here, even though it looks carved, this is kind of a modeling, like a gesso that's modeled to create this nice form on the outside. And then what do we have in the center panel? We have the Madonna of Humility. She is beautifully depicted sitting on the floor. And that is why we call her the Madonna of Humility, because she's not in the throne, which we'll see in the next Buonaccorso, also in our Timken collection. So she sits on the floor and she holds the baby Jesus. And you can see that this is, you know, late 14th century, but it is still very proto-Renaissance. It still carries some of the stylization of International Gothic, which was refined and elegant, and some of that Byzantine, kind of flat or more two-dimensional. However, when you look at St. John, he's beginning to evolve into a more three-dimensional figure. St. Catherine, a little bit more so as well. So Madonna holds the baby Jesus, who does not look particularly well developed. However, he holds one of the bobbins, threads from her basket. We have a very early still life incorporated into this altarpiece. We have, of course, the crucifixion and St. Francis again. Mary and St. Gabriel. Catherine, who was martyred on a wheel. You can see that's her attribute for martyrdom. And then we have St. John and St. Christopher. St. Christopher was the patron saint of travel. And so he is standing in a waterway with the fish swimming around. And also we have him holding the baby Jesus with the globe. So as I mentioned, the globe refers to his patronage for travel, and then he holds a reed in his hand. This altarpiece, again, like the predecessor, the De Tomei, could have been used for private devotion for a wealthy family, Sienese family, or it could have been placed in a niche in the Siena Cathedral. Because we have a lot of images and our time isn't that long, I'm going to go on to the next Buonaccorso. This is a really exquisite piece done a little bit later. And this too would have been, as I mentioned with the Giotto, this would have been a center panel for a much larger altarpiece. It's quite a bit larger than the previous image. And it does, of course, show the Madonna and Child. And of course, as you see, it's part of our Timken collection. It is really remarkable when I think about it, and having had visited Siena, to see that the Timken in San Diego has 3 masterpieces of Sienese art. And it's not very common not very common to see Sienese masterpieces in West Coast museums. So that's a very crucial factor in sort of studying these works. Now, we think that this Madonna was probably to honor a female religious order. Because of many of these artists, where were they putting their artwork? Well, as the Renaissance progresses, we see private, like the Medicis, for example, commissioning artists. But of course, the Catholic Church still is commissioning a lot of these pieces. They're doing commissions for convents, for monasteries, for churches, for private devotion, and manuscripts. So there's a lot of opportunity for these artists to create. Now, so I mentioned that a female order probably commissioned this. You can tell this exquisite Madonna, even though, again, this is Sienese, she does have a little bit of this sort of stylized face that is a little bit less naturalistic, because the Sienese artists, compared to the Florentine artists, are much more conservative. So they did not develop quite as successfully this very realistic, humanistic style. Remember, these artists are starting to understand humanism as an important concept in culture and art. Eventually, we see how church subjects become less seen, and we begin to see things like mythological themes and portraiture. But here in Siena, in the later part of the 14th century, we still have mostly religious imagery. Now, she looks very lovingly at the baby Jesus. He holds a tiny flower basket. He offers her this exquisite white rose, which signifies Madonna and her white purity and spirituality. She sits in a Gothic throne, this magnificent Gothic throne, and we have the star-crested clothing and the blue cloak, of course, which is her usual ubiquitous attire. And then, of course, that red is often shown, and the blue relates to heaven and spirituality. The gold leaf is the importance of these religious subject matters. So again, this Gothic throne, and we have these red finials, very highly decorative. You can see a lot of three-dimensionality in the way the baby sits on her knee. So we're getting a more model form, not as flat, not as two-dimensional. We have this really pretty skin tone and some kind of complicated little carvings here. And then we have, again, the Stella Maris, a star of the sea. And then later, when we look at the birth of Venus by Botticelli, we can see where that name actually kind of crosses over with this belief in birth from the sea. And so we'll talk about that a little bit further. Okay, so this is part of a central panel, much larger altarpiece, and done in Siena. Now, we're going to move on to the painting I just talked about, Sandro Botticelli. And Botticelli was so unique, so unique. So this is still part of what we consider the early Renaissance. It's getting closer to the High Renaissance, which again is about 1490. And we have amazing mythological theme, not a religious theme, because Florence was a little bit more open. You know, we had the Medici families, the Sforzas in Milan, the Strozzis, and also in Florence. And these were rich families, controlled the city-states. So Italy wasn't a unified country. In the Renaissance, it was these duchies, these small communities ruled by these wealthy banking families. And probably the most prominent was the Medici. And they were involved with all kinds of civic development, religious, secular painting. And this was a commission by one of the Medicis. And what it shows is the birth of Venus. Now, Botticelli did several remarkable mythological themes. One, of course, is La Primavera, which is also in the Uffizi, as is this. So he was known to have a connection to mythology. Remember, in the Renaissance, which means rebirth, you know, we see the birth of Venus, the rebirth. It's a rebirth of Greek and Roman classical ideals, taken from mythology. We actually even see her in a contrapposta pose, which was taken from Greek sculpture and Roman sculpture. We have here an idealized beauty. It's almost, it's unique. Even though it's naturalistic, which was very important to the Florentine painters, there's a kind of a whimsical quality to her. So although she looks realistic, she is exquisite, and it's more almost like dreamlike or lyrical. And she stands, as I mentioned, this contrapposto pose, shifted weight. However, she's not very firm on her feet. So it doesn't seem really, uh, she's not really able to stand firmly. So it's kind of a floating. And what do we have here? So it was said that she was birthed from the sea, the goddess of love and beauty. Her father was Cronius. And here we have the Zephyr and another Oriole, winds. So the two winds, this is a strong wind and a lighter wind blowing at her. And then we have one of the goddesses of the seasons trying to cloak her in this exquisite floral cloak. And the dresses also with the laurel leaves, the god Apollo wore the laurel leaves. So this comes from Greek mythology. We have this exquisite forest that not particularly naturalistic, but still quite beautiful. She seems to be, the shell seems to be floating, almost reaching the shoreline, which, as you can see, the shell is very naturalistic, but not quite here. Some people would attribute Christian ideology to this painting and say, well, this is actually Eve in the Garden of Eden. Others say, no, this is quite significantly a mythological theme. So we also have these white roses, and it is said that the rose emerged with the birth of Venus. And then we also have some other flowers in the foreground here and some around here, but these were attributed to Venus. So if you look at this palette, it's really exquisite. It almost looks Venetian in coloration. And when we get to some of the Venetian painters, I'm going to show you how color becomes so important. But however, this is obviously Florentine. You have to remember too that artists like Botticelli, although he was mainly in Florence, some of his colleagues also worked in other cities like Rome. They might have traveled to Venice, but Botticelli was working with the Medicis to create these magnificent works. So I'm going to move on because we have so many important paintings to see. We have a Botrofio. This is part of our Timken collection, a portrait of a youth holding an arrow. And this painting was once attributed to Leonardo da Vinci, but it is determined subsequently that it was school of, and so Botrofio, a wealthy Milanese artist who did go to Florence to work with Leonardo, painted it. And stylistically, I showed this last week because you can see this is the student and this is the master. And if you look stylistically, the faces and some of the attributes well, style of the painting is quite similar. Okay, so let's go back to the Botrofio and talk a little bit about him. So he paints what we think is the poet Cassio. And Cassio comes from an aristocratic family, as did Botrofio. And Botrofio really didn't need to work, and he had the opportunity, the latitude to work in with Leonardo and develop some of his styles that were consistent with Leonardo. Just a sidebar, this painting was actually at one time owned by Lord Elgin of the famed Elgin marbles before it subsequently came to the Timken. Now, this is a very androgynous figure. And you see this very high contrast black background, and you also see this type of light. Now, he learned from Leonardo to use a type of light source called sfumato. And when I talked last week about the Spanish Baroque, I talked to you a lot about chiaroscuro, which is light on dark, but then we also talked about tenebrism, which was very popular among the Spanish Baroque painters. And that is that really intense kind of black on black. But here we have a softer modeling of light. And as I mentioned, it's called sfumato. So he wears Cassio, an androgynous figure who was a poet, a real poet, and he wears the laurel leaves fillet that Apollo would have worn. And notice the arrow, that would have been an attribute of Apollo. He was the god of poetry and creativity, as some of the activity he did. And so you would see him holding these things just as Apollo would. And then, of course, you can see that he was an aristocrat, these beautiful clothes, this exquisite, soft, kind of velvety cape, and we have a pearl, remember the pearl bling of that time period, and then of course this 3/4 portrait. So painted by an aristocrat, of an aristocrat, studied with Leonardo. Now, perhaps one of the greatest paintings ever created in Western art, and by far the most recognized, is the Mona Lisa. And is painted by Leonardo around the same time as the Botrofio. And it has, again, those similar characteristics to the Botrofio. However, what Leonardo does for first time, really, almost the first time in Florentine art, is to show a landscape. Also, the perspective is quite unusual. It is an aerial perspective. Now, he was not the first to use aerial perspective. That was the Flemish artist, Bruegel, Peter Bruegel the Elder, in our own very own Parable of the Sower in the Timken, uses aerial perspective. But we see this exquisite Florentine landscape. Although we really don't see humans in here, we do see the bridge, this beautiful bridge, and we see the mountains, and we see pathways. So it is a very well-developed landscape. She sits in a loggia, which is an open room that looks out on a landscape. And then she sits in a very nice high back chair. You can just see little remnants of it. Her hand right here, and her hands are crossed very delicately. I've said this many times, and I do think it bears repeating. The hands are exquisite, absolutely so naturalistic. And and the hands were the hardest thing for artists to paint, so it really shows his skill. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this painting, but I do want to mention that, during, this is now into the High Renaissance, which begins 1490 and goes into about 1530. During the High Renaissance, really the three greats are Raphael, Leonardo, and Michelangelo. And some people say, well, who was the greatest? Who really was the greatest? Well, we know that Leonardo did not paint that many paintings. He was very involved with scientific exploration, invention, sketching, studying the human body. And so there's not that many paintings extant by Leonardo. And then we have Michelangelo, his great rival. Leonardo was about 20 years older than Michelangelo, and he did encounter him in Florence. Later, Leonardo did work in Rome. He also ended up his career in the French court, went to France where he died in 1519. So this is the time period when he was painting in Florence. And so Vasari, the great art historian, did document these artists, Leonardo and Michelangelo. And he actually said that, well, he actually did a biography of Michelangelo. It was the first real biography of an artist. And he weighed in and said, well, maybe Michelangelo, because he was a sculptor and he was a painter and an architect. So maybe we can edge Michelangelo, but really that's kind of a silly kind of argument because they were both geniuses. Now, you can see that she is unadorned. She has a thin veil here. It is considered that she may have been pregnant at this time. They call her La Gioconda. And really, her name comes from Giocondo, from the word Giocondo, which means joviality. And when it was kind of a play on her name, but her married name, but also it was meant by Leonardo to paint something of happiness. He wanted a positive female form. The other thing is she is so enigmatic. Everybody hears that term, Mona Lisa, very enigmatic. And of course that is true. We don't know. She looks at us with kind of a bit of mystery, and that actually enhances her beauty and her value. Some people would say, this is just a supposition, that in a way it was a little bit of a self-portrait of Leonardo. And if you do look at self-portraits from this time period, the facial characteristics are kind of similar. So again, a lot of mystery. It's a very small painting. And if you see it at the Louvre, now it has its own $6.5 million gallery. It is so remarkable, the colors, the form, the mystery. And so therefore, it does become probably the most iconic painting in Western art. Now, Lastly, we're going to go to another artist who worked in Florence and later in Rome with the Vatican, is Michelangelo. And this is the Holy Family known as the Doni Tondo. And Doni was a Florentine merchant, very wealthy man who married into the Strozzi family. And the Strozzi family were kind of competitors with the Medici family, who were bankers. And they made a ton of money, and they really controlled a lot of the cultural experience in Florence at that time. So what do we have here? We have the Holy Family, and again, it was a gift for the marriage of Donne to Strozzi. So we have the original tondo frame. This comes from Michelangelo. And there's a lot of carving, and there's these distinct forms that we really don't know exactly what they represent. And we don't even know what this is St. John the Baptist, by the way, but these figures, casually and very sculptural forms, we don't know too much about them. Very importantly, this was the only later panel piece of Michelangelo that is extant, meaning it's the only one that survived. So this is very remarkable. And also what's remarkable is this tondo configuration. Okay, so we know that Michelangelo did eventually work for the Vatican. He was given the go-ahead by the Catholic Church to study corpses so that he could create sculptural realism and realism in painting. He also was an architect. So we know that he was just look at the David, Moses, etc., the Pietà. We know he was a brilliant sculptor, and you can see the model forms, how developed it is. When we looked at the Giotto, done 200 years in the Proto-Renaissance, and here we're now in the High Renaissance, you can see stylistically how evolved it became, how three-dimensional, how realistic, this humanistic style. So we actually have here the Madonna, and she takes up most of the tondo. And we have Joseph, and it's not really clear, is the baby Jesus being handed off to Madonna, or is Joseph handing it to Madonna, or Madonna handing him to Joseph? But he's a very well-developed, very natural-looking baby Jesus. Now, the Madonna sits on a pillow, which is a little bit hard to see. You can see maybe remnants of it right here. And then she has this beautiful green-red cloak that's draped over her knee. Again, she's in that red and blue. That was her colors, spirituality. And then we have just the emergence of a little bit of a background. So this gift, this Doni Tondo, the last remaining older panel piece by Michelangelo. Now, we're going to go into Venice. And I want to tell you a little bit about Venetian art. It's really special. Venice is a magical city, and it was separated by its water situate. It's pivotal point on waterways, like a series of islands. So it was kind of unique. Venice had a really developed city and planning, and it had wealth. It was also the center of illuminated manuscripts and then later book printing in Venice, because remember, Gutenberg invents the printing press. So now we have, at this time, 1506, we have books being printed. So they were disseminated through Italy out of Venice. And we have some stylistic characterizations that I want to point out. One thing, we have a freer brushstroke with Venetian art. We have an exquisite palette, kind of oily paints were used. They did a lot of layering with the pigments, a lot of shading, which was really quite, there's a lot of harmony in these paintings. Excuse me. And the Venetian artists many times thought that color was actually more important than line. And I want to tell you, really, the master of Venetian painting was Bellini. Bellini was sort of the father of Venetian painting. And then we go into other great Venetian painters like Giorgione, and after him, Titian. And so because we don't have a lot of time, I do want to talk to you just quickly about the tempest. And the tempest is a strong wind. And you know, Shakespeare immortalized it in his own play, The Tempest. So we have a wind kind of brewing here where you can definitely see this glazing and exquisite color of the Venetian Renaissance. We have a woman nursing a child. We have sort of her abdomen kind of revealed. Rather a little bit of a sensuous portrayal. We have a man here, but he doesn't really look like lasciviously at her. He's kind of just glancing. In a Pintamento, the underpainting of this Giorgione, they thought that this figure was originally a woman, but here we have a man. And some people would say that it's actually a representation of Giorgione himself, who depicts his own mistress. And that's debated. We don't know. Some people just say this allegory is just a mystery. Like Lord Byron, for example, said, of all the paintings in the Renaissance, this is my favorite because you don't really know what's happening. But again, we have this exquisite landscape, the buildings, the greenery here, the verdant landscape, and these exquisite forms. Excuse me. Again, for time's sake, I want to just move on a little bit. And I want to, so I did, I apologize, I showed you Venetian artists, and now I'm going back to Raphael, who did a lot of work in Florence, at least for this painting. And as I mentioned, he was part of the triumvirate of Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael. We could do a whole hour just on him. This Madonna the Goldfinch is quite remarkable. It was a gift to one of Raphael's friends who was an aristocrat. And sadly, the painting was put in his palazzo, but there was a massive earthquake. So this painting was actually broken into 17 pieces. It took years and years for this painting to be put back together and conserved. And they did a really remarkable job. So the Madonna was a gift. We have one of the most exquisite Madonnas ever painted. And what is the symbolism here? Okay, so we have the baby Jesus, and he puts his little hand on this goldfinch. And then we have St. John, and he is holding the burden offering for view to the baby Jesus. And of course, Madonna holds a book. And of course, you know, during humanism and literature and writing was very important at this time in Florence. So the book, of course, is important. We have, again, this landscape, the influence of Leonardo, beautiful landscape, bridges, trees, rocks. And you see like a three-dimensional, almost a triangular formation here with the Madonna. And she looks so lovingly and so naturalistically at the baby Jesus, and well, actually St. John as he holds the bird. The goldfinch represents the crucifixion, because it was said that this drop of blood would come from Christ and it fell on this bird that was nearby. So this does represent the crucifixion. Because of time, I want to show you one or two more paintings really quickly. This is our own Sobaldo. This was Venetian. Sobaldo did study in Venice. He was married to a Flemish woman. And so you can see elements of Peter Bruegel here, who he did study from Bruegel's imagery. And we have a version of hell. It also represents what we saw during the plague, hell. And Saint Anthony, the patron saint of monasteries, flees from hell and damnation. He flees to a monastery here, which is more light and spirituality. Here is death and destruction. Garden of Earthly Delights quoted. We have the Ship of Fools. We have the Tower of Babel. And he flees to the monastery in a hand of prayer with a white shawl draped over him. I'm sorry, I'm rushing, but I'm going to go. I wanted to show you a couple more. This is a Venetian painting by Bartolomeo Veneto, also in our Timken collection. Highborn woman of the court, Isabella d'Este. We think she might have been dead when this portrait was done, but we do see her with a hawking glove, something that a lot of the aristocrats actually did as a leisure activity. We have her very exquisite clothing. We have a little signature of the artist here, and we have an elaborate headdress to show just the importance of the court and her highborn position. I'm rushing through, I really apologize. I did want to show you one more Venetian painting before we wrap it up. And this is Venus of Urbino. by Titian. So Titian studied under Giorgione and was inspired by Giorgione, and sometimes people actually mistake some of Giorgione and Titian's work. This is a very dark and beautiful painting, and it was given to the Duke of Urbino, and it was a gift, and it was supposed to be of his bride, although some people say perhaps his mistress. And it was said to show Venus, the most beautiful woman. She's elegant, she's seductive, she holds a group of flowers, and it was meant to be kind of instructive. As the Duke was saying, this is how a woman should be, willing to be part of the marital bed and be faithful. We have a dog for fidelity. We have a young woman looking in her trousseau, her chest, and then another lady in waiting, and this exquisite night view from this window, and just this elegant, elongated body, exquisite face. She looks at us with strength, and she's on these exquisite pillows. I think I have time for one more painting, and I did want to show you this Rape of Europa, also by Titian. And if you look at the time period, slightly different, we go like almost 30 years later. So the Rape of Europa is a mythological theme that Zeus, Jupiter, hides and transforms himself into a bull, and he carries away Europa. And in some characterizations of this painting, she's very fearful, she's scared. Here, she's a little less fearful and a little more willing, perhaps. We see her being made fun of by this little putti on they say it's a dolphin, it really looks like a fish. We see people yelling on the background, oh, what is happening? What is happening? And then these cupids who are trying to shoot arrows of love. Now you see very much this Venetian style. Now I see our time is up. I've kind of gone over, I apologize. And perhaps Samantha can let us know if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Karen. No worries about rushing towards the end. It's a huge topic, so it's definitely difficult to cover, but thank you so much. That was such an interesting talk, a virtual round of applause for that. Perfect. So if there are any questions, as I mentioned up top, you can feel free to either go ahead and ask, or you can use the chat box in order to type out your question. We'd be happy to address those. And again, if you are joining us through Facebook, you can also use the chat function or the comment section there, sorry, in order to ask any questions that you may have. So yeah, we'd be happy to take any questions. I saw some. Oh, so why is the woman considered dead for the Veneto?
Oh, so, there's a lot of mystery in that painting, but they think it was posthumously painted. So, and you can kind of see that. Look at sort of the very pale face. And it is still, I think, kind of going back and forth if that was true, but it is considered that she had passed away when this portrait was finished. And again, it's this ghostly skin tone that might have suggested that. Yeah. But I don't think that's 100% determined. That is just a hypothesis. But that's a good question. Very good question.
Yes, thank you so much, Helen, for that question. Ken is also saying, excellent presentation. Thanks, very interesting. Thank you, Karen. Yeah, it is such a, rich subject matter. As you said, you could do a presentation on just one of those artists alone because
absolutely. I mean, just
an amazing body of work for all of them. But you did a great job in, kind of choosing pieces that are representative of the period and of the Renaissance itself. And so thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. It helps to have such a wonderful collection at the Timken. So that kind of inspired me because we do have Venetian and we do have, a lot of Sienese, et cetera. So that really, was the genesis of this talk.
Yes, absolutely. And as you mentioned, it's so amazing that we do, at San Diego have the opportunity to see these kinds of pieces. Normally you would have to, as we said, travel to Siena or Florence or any of those, but you could just, step out your back door and go over once we open back up at the Timken and check out those pieces.
Exactly.
Yeah. Great. Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, I don't see any other questions. I do see lots of thank you though from Becky and Ken. So thank you again, Karen.
Oh, my pleasure.
Oh, perfect. So Before you guys head out, as I mentioned, this talk and other talks are recorded and they are posted on our social media, on our Facebook, on our YouTube. So please feel free to go back and take a look if you would like. You can also find information for our next upcoming tours as well on our website. So if you go to our website, you'll find an event calendar, and that way you can kind of get caught up with all the different tours that are being presented. Kind of, as I said, while the Timken is still closed, we're happy to be able to still bring you some of these virtual tours, and that way you can, kind of still see our collection through Zoom. So again, please feel free to check those out and get the links for those future upcoming tours. Annette's saying thank you as well. So thank you, Annette. And otherwise, though, I hope everyone enjoys your day and has a great day. Thank you again, Karen, and have a great.
Thank you for all who attended, and thank you, Samantha, for all your help.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.